Hello everyone, welcome to this Reconnect webinar. I'm Andrione-Moylan from the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven, and I will be moderating this webinar entitled Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone, with Professor Vivien Schmidt, Monnet Chair of European Integration and Professor of International Relations and Political Science at Boston University, and Professor Kolja Raube, Assistant Professor for European Studies at the University of Leuven. Today's presenter really needs no introduction. In her distinguished career, Professor Schmidt research has led to some major contributions in the field of political theory and comparative and international politics, European integration, and European political economy. Her work on discursive institutionalism remains an important point of reference for ideational and discursive approaches in political science, most recently with her 2016 journal article entitled Power Through and Over in Ideas, Conceptualizing Ideational Power and Discursive Institutionalism. Professor Schmidt's input, throughput, output, legitimacy framework, which is re-examined in a 2019 paper entitled Conceptualizing Throughput Legitimacy, Procedural Mechanisms of Accountability, Transparency, Inclusiveness, and Openness in EU Governance, also remains a seminal approach in analyzing legitimacy in the EU. Professor Schmidt is currently visiting professor at Leuven University in Rome and at the Copenhagen Business School. She has been the recipient of a Rockefeller Bellagio Center residency, 2 Fulbright fellowships, and a Guggenheim fellowship too. In 2018, she received the title of Chevalier in the French Legion of Honor. And finally, this year, she was named one of the top 100 currently most cited scholars in the Political Science 400 rankings. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us today, Professor Schmidt, also in view of your forthcoming book, published with Oxford University Press in 2020, which will develop a lot of the topics that you will discuss today. Participating as discussant is Professor Kolja Raube, who is Assistant Professor for European Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Leuven, where he is Program Coordinator at the Master of European Studies. He's also Adjunct Professor at the American University in Washington, D.C. at the Brussels campus and Visiting Professor at Kobe University in Japan, as well as Visiting Research Fellow at the EU Studies Center at the University of Illinois. In his capacity as research manager at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, he takes part in our Reconnect project. Kolja Raube has published widely on the European Parliament, interparliamentary cooperation in the European Union and global governance, as well as security policies, the rule of law, legitimacy and coherence in EU external action. Most recently, he co-edited a volume on parliamentary cooperation and diplomacy in EU external relations, and he co-authored a journal article with Ben Tonra entitled From Internal Input to External Output, a Multi-Tiered Understanding of Legitimacy in EU Foreign Policy. So thank you very much for joining us today. As for the general structure of this webinar, firstly, Professor Schmidt will present for about 25 minutes. Then Professor Raube will have the chance to share his reflections with us, and Professor Schmidt will then have the opportunity to reply. As always, during the presentations, you may send your questions and comments to me via the webinar chat box, which you can access from the control panel. After the presentations, I will bring your questions into the discussion and allow our speakers to respond. So it's now my great pleasure to give the floor to our distinguished speaker, Professor Vivien Schmidt, and we very much look forward to your presentation. You have the floor.
Thank you, Alex, for that lovely introduction. Thank you all webinar participants for being there. I can't see you, but you can see me. And my talk today is on my forthcoming book with Oxford University Press, Europe's Crisis of Legitimacy, Governing by Rules and Ruling by Numbers in the Eurozone. There we go. So Europe's Euro crisis of legitimacy is a crisis that's not just about the economics, it's also about politics and democracy. In the EU, where there were divided preferences, institutional constraints to taking action, legal obstacles to taking the most innovative actions, what we saw is that EU leaders and institutional actors doubled down on the rules. They decided to govern by rules and ruling by numbers. And this essentially was, as I'll discuss today, put democratic legitimacy at risk, in particular because what happened with the governing by rules and ruling by numbers is we ended up with deteriorating economics in the EU and in the Eurozone and increasingly toxic politics. But so what did EU actors do? They just, recognizing the problems, they began to reinterpret the rules and recalibrate the numbers, but they did this by stealth. That is, without admitting it. Some, it was very clearly by stealth because they could not admit it. In others, it was hiding the truth, even as they told it. So the result is you ended up with incremental improvement, but we continued to have suboptimal rules because not admitting them meant you didn't try to change them, and increasing perceptions of illegitimacy. So you might ask, so why are we talking about legitimacy in the Euro crisis at all? After all, there are lots of books out there that use the word legitimacy, don't go in it, but essentially focus on the political economy, focus on the politics, or maybe focus on the governance. But by talking about legitimacy, for me, this provides an opportunity to consider all aspects of the crisis, the political economy, the politics, and the governance processes. But importantly, and this speaks to the introduction that referenced my work on discursive institutionalism, here I take EU actors as sentient agents, rather than see them as rational actors motivated by interests or responding to certain incentive structures, or rather than seeing them as actors completely constrained by path-dependent rules or their roles, or even as agents who follow cultural scripts or determined in a way by their frames. I see EU actors as thinking, speaking, acting agents who also seek to legitimate their actions. So what I do in the book and what I'm going to talk about here is the way in which EU institutional actors themselves sought not only to figure out, to puzzle through what do we do in this crisis, but also how do we legitimate whatever it is that we say we're going to do. So this is discursive institutionalism as a methodological approach. I'm not going to go into detail, just to signal. Discursive institutionalism focuses on the substantive content of ideas and the interactive processes of discourse in institutional context. And by institutional context, I mean in two ways. It's the meaning context, what do these ideas mean? It's the logic of communication, what are the processes by which, or the discursive processes by which people say what they're going to say. So it's not only what is said, but who's talking to whom, where, when, and how. But focusing on meaning and logics of communication does not mean that I ignore the other kinds of institutional contexts illuminated and elaborated by the other kinds of new institutionalism. So the results of rational choice institutionalism, historical institutionalism, and sociological institutionalism also serve as background information. I've always been very much a methodological pluralist, and part of the reason I moved into looking at ideas and discourse was essentially to be able to add that to social scientists' toolkit, if you will, because in the 1990s, with the so-called methodological wars, ideas and discourse ended up dropping out of the toolkit as people focused on interests, on institutions, or on culture. So by using discursive institutionalism as an added, and in this case, central approach, it serves as a bridge to legitimacy. I can go from empirics to norms and values, but I also look at power. And here I conceive of power as ideational as well as coercive and institutional dependent. So Now we have to ask, how do we define democracy and legitimacy? And as simply as possible, I define democracy as a form of representative government, and I talk about legitimacy in two ways. One, legitimacy as a governing authority. So this is the Weberian. This is the most basic way of talking about it. And it's essentially whether a government of any form is accepted by its citizens. But there's a second way to think about legitimacy, and that's legitimacy as governing activity. And this is an assumption that it's not just you accept a governing authority, but also how governments and governors act becomes important to whether or not you continue to accept that governing authority. And that's when elected governments govern responsibly and responsively to benefit the public interest and in keeping with common values. So our big question is the EU democratically legitimate? So as a governing authority, I would say yes, because what we've seen is that it has built public consent, if only tacit, in policy after policy area over time. It starts with the customs union, international trade, all of these areas slowly but surely, supremacy for the ECJ, etc. But is the EU a democracy? Well, the EU itself is not a democracy in the typical sense that we apply to nation states, but the EU's member states are democracy. And of course, the EU is its member states. They're all so far intertwined that it's almost impossible to pull it out. But the one thing that is important is that the very existence of the EU undermines member state democracy. We'll talk about that later. But so what about the EU's democratic legitimacy in terms of governing activity? And for that depends. And for this, we're also going to need to look more deeply into what is the EU's legitimacy as a governing activity? How do we define the legitimacy of the EU's governing activities? And here I bring in systems terms from European Union studies, but if you don't like output, input, throughput, we could just talk about legitimacy as political, and political legitimacy, which is what we typically think of as democratic legitimacy, performance legitimacy, which is outcomes, which is output, and procedural legitimacy, which is about governance. So output, performance criterion about policy effectiveness, performance. Input legitimacy is a political criterion. It's about representation, it's about participation of citizens, but it's also about responsiveness of political elites. And importantly here, often in literature, we assume a trade-off. If there's a lot of good performance, then even if the citizens don't have a say, it's okay. It is seen as legitimate by the citizens. But what if the citizens vote for something really bad, stupid, doesn't work? It's still legitimate because the citizens voted for it. So in this sense, there's a trade-off between input and output legitimacy, or between good performance and good political participation. But what about the term that I introduced into the debate, which I guess I introduced in 2013 or so, throughput legitimacy, which is a term that actually has been used by others and not quite in this way. So throughput legitimacy is a procedural criterion of legitimacy, and it's about the quality of the processes. So the technical standard of legitimacy would be efficacy, but the more normative standards are accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, openness, and part of the reason for having this is that what I saw in the literature is that there was a lot on input and output, and everything that's part of those two circles, participation, responsiveness, effectiveness, performance. But in the literature, you ended up having some people talk about accountability, others transparency, inclusiveness, open, in some separate literatures. And so I thought useful to take the term throughput to group these all together in a way that we could then look at throughput in comparison to output and input, but also to look at these various criteria that are part of procedural legitimacy, look at them one against the other. Can you be accountable and transparent at the same time? What about inclusiveness? How does that affect transparency or efficacy, etc.? But importantly, and that's why it's useful to have this third term, there are no trade-offs, or at least not the same kinds of trade-offs as you have between input and output. And part of the problem, in particular in the EU, is there's an assumption, well, that there's a trade-off amongst all three. No. But what I find, and what I'll be talking about, is that with legitimacy, with throughput legitimacy, sorry, there's a constant telephone calls asking me for money to contribute to the Democrats usually. But we'll leave that aside. I guess that's also about legitimacy. So with throughput legitimacy, there are no trade-offs. If you as a public servant have followed the procedures really well, it disappears, it's invisible, and it looks like input goes straight to output. Sorry. This is ridiculous. Sorry. That's a problem of, this is a problem of throughput legitimacy, because it's all of these phone calls that come in asking me to log something. Okay, so there are no trade-offs. If throughput legitimacy is good, it's invisible. If it's bad, if people find governance incompetent, biased, whatever, it can skew the input, political input, and taint the output. So here's a nice slide that shows how confusing it can be. But it's essentially not all that confusing. Citizens have input to national governments that then represent the citizens in the council and on. But I'm not going to go through that. That will take too long. But we are going to talk about this because what you could see from that slide is that in the EU, there's a split level legitimacy. At the EU level, you end up with output and throughput legitimacy. At the national level, input legitimacy. And what I mean by that, it's at the national level that citizens elect their representatives, and it's at the EU level that those representatives then perhaps represent them, but the citizens don't have any direct or much direct say. At the EU level, it's about policy performance and governance, accountability, transparency, etc. And what we've seen also is, however, that whereas that kind of split has long been the case, where the politics remains at the national level and the procedures and the performance are mainly focused on the EU level, this has been changing. Because as we've seen increasingly politicization at the bottom, at the national level, especially growing Euroscepticism, that has increased pressure, political pressure, in particular on the council. And as we've moved from a permissive consensus to more of a constraining consensus, or even a destructive dissensus in some cases, in the migration crisis. At the top, so politicization at the bottom, pushes politicization from the bottom up, and what we find is at the top then you see a new politicized dynamics of interaction. The council wants to be in charge, and this is also in the literature. We've seen a new in old and new intergovernmentalism, arguing that the council is in charge versus supranationalism that says no, it's the Commission and the ECB that are in control. But we also see that the European Parliament has had increasingly greater influence. But this politicized dynamics of interaction is that the Council wants to be in charge and is not happy when the Commission takes control, and has often complained about the ECB as well. We'll get to that later. Even as the European Parliament complains about the Council and the Commission not being accountable, for example. All of this in terms of the Eurozone crisis. So I guess the last piece of this, of the question is politicization a good thing or a bad thing? Well, you could argue that it's bad because the content of the recriminations, the council saying the commission shouldn't do this, it's acting without proper authority, or the ECB complaints that the ECB is engaged from German economists and the Bundesbank that the ECB is going too far with quantitative easing, etc. The European Parliament complaining about the Commission or the Council, you could argue that the substance of the complaints make it politicization a bad thing. Bad thing in the sense that they make it appear as if the actions taken are illegitimate. But on the other hand, you could say that politicization is a good thing in terms of a process. Because what we're seeing is, at the EU level, more like what goes on at the national level, i.e. more interaction, more political debate, deliberation, and contestation. And after all, that is what democratic legitimacy is all about. So perhaps, although there's good and bad to this politicization, but this is all background to what we're going to be talking about in a minute. But what about the dilemmas of throughput legitimacy? And this is in the Eurozone crisis. So we saw EU actors first reinforce the rules. They assume that all they need is to have good quality throughput. So all you do is need to reinforce the rules, follow the rules. Good procedures will lead to good performance, good output, so performance legitimacy. So we don't need any input, i.e. political citizen participation or even government responsiveness to what citizens would like, which is often generally not the policies that were produced. But what you saw is with the bad policy, output performance, and increasing political input volatility, EU actors reinterpret the rules by stealth. They engage in increasing flexibility in their interpretation of the rules, but they generally don't admit it in the discourse. And what we have then are problems with throughput, with output, and with input, as you can read, but also as I've just mentioned. And the problem with not admitting in the input, in the discourse, is that, for example, if you say, we're sticking to the rules, even as you accommodate, as you reinterpret them for this case or that case or that case in different ways, the Southern Europeans, Spaniards, will feel oppressed even when they're accommodated, and Northern Europeans, Germans, will feel deceived regardless. That's really the problem, not admitting that you're reinterpreting rules, let alone the fact that you're stuck with those same old rules that don't work. But it's important to see that the kinds of reinterpretations and also the reinforcement of the rules in the first place involve very different pathways to legitimacy for the different actors. So I'm going to go through relatively quickly. So we start with the council, and what you're going to see is with each of these actors, I'm going to be talking about a sort of a Janus-based view, different public perceptions of these different actors. So for the council, is it a dictator or a deliberative body? These are the main questions. So first we have to ask, what about power and procedural legitimacy? Often in the council, you have leaders saying we're a representative forum, Sarkozy, Merkel, but actually this is not a representative forum. It's much more of a bargaining arena. And to whom is the council accountable? Actually, to no one. Is it a benevolent hegemon? Well, there's not that much benevolence there. We can go into that in the questions if anyone wants to go on that. But what about mutual accountability? Okay, if it's not representation, so it's not input legitimacy, what about throughput legitimacy and talking about the deliberative mutual accountability? Here too, we have to ask the question. So first, and this is, is this about German diktats? Following one-size-fits-one rules, and you can guess who the one is. Here the arguments would go, yeah, Germany basically got what it wanted in terms of its political and economic interests. Look at how the Constitutional Court acted to basically the only court that inserted itself in the process. And in Merkel with Sarkozy, Germany essentially overshadows France. So generally speaking, you could argue Germany got its way, a dictator. Certainly that's the view of Southern Europeans. But on the other hand, couldn't we see it instead as a deliberative body? After all, everyone did agree on the rules, and there was a lot of deliberation. So at most we could say that this is deliberation perhaps in the shadow of Germany. And look at how the way in which, in particular after 2012, we go from a discourse of stability to growth, even not much was done about it, but at least there was the discourse of it, then flexibility in 2014 and investment in 2015. But for program countries, I suppose, rather than asking is a dictator a deliberative body, we have to ask, is it a harsh dictatorship or deliberative authoritarianism? Certainly the Troika and the Eurogroup, in particular for Greece, perhaps less so with Ireland or Portugal, you could say Greece, harsh dictatorship, certainly with the 2015 bailout, deliberative authoritarianism. After all, Ireland and Portugal didn't have a choice, but they did deliberate. What about the ECB? Hero of the crisis, Super Mario, or ogre? Again, power and procedural legitimacy we have to ask first. The ECB is the most independent of central banks, but it has also been very clear in its attempts to build accountability by expert networks and its quarterly meetings with the European Parliament to explain what it does. So as the hero, this is about monetary policy. It goes from one size fits none to essentially whatever it takes in Mario Draghi's famous line in 2012 that stops the crisis, or at least the fast-burning phase of the crisis. And interestingly here, that by stealth is not as stealthy as in other cases, that Mario Draghi and the ECB hides its interpretation in plain view as it moves from a very narrow definition of its mandate, no, we can't be a lender of last resort, says Trichet, to a very expansive one. Not only does it say in 2012, we'll do whatever it takes, but it moves to quantitative easing by 2015. So in all of this, you could say that this made it the hero. It also coordinates with export networks. Bundesbank gets increasingly isolated. The main opponent of the kind of reinterpretation, and there's a charm offensive with Merkel for a year to ensure that we get banking union, etc. There's a very different charisma. Although you can talk about charismatic leadership for both Trichet and Draghi, Draghi clearly exercises tremendous leadership. But on the other hand, you could argue that Draghi's an ogre. Draghi or the ECB is, because the ECB pushed austerity and structural reforms. Yes, it becomes something of a lender of last resort, but with conditionality. And there is a quid pro quo. In exchange for us saving you, you have to engage in harsh austerity and structural reform. And what about Trichet's letters to various countries that push them into programs? So next, the Commission. Are they ayatollahs of austerity or ministers of moderation? Here again, we have to talk about power and procedural legitimacy. And here it's about accountability, that it's only procedural legitimacy. We can't say there's input legitimacy involved here. And here the accountability forum for the Commission is the Council, and increasingly over time to the European Parliament, but in particular, at first, it's accountable. It's turned into something of a secretariat in those first 2 years. But you know, the Commission finds itself between a rock, Northern Europe, and a hard place, Southern Europe. So as ayatollahs of austerity, that's very much 2010 to 2012. It's an enforcer in the European semester, applying one-size-fits-all rules. Of course, in the Troika is really when you can talk about ayatollahs of austerity, but the Commission was indeed following the Eurogroup recommendations, although in this point it was quite austere, if you will. And of course, simply the fact of the European semester reduces input legitimacy at the national level, because national parliaments are basically largely shut out of the decision-making process. But then, are they really just ayatollahs of austerity? Or what about ministers of moderation? And from 2013 on, what you see is as the output legitimacy fails, performance fails, we see increasing flexibility coming from the Commission. You see a slowing of deficit reduction. You see changes in the way in which structural reforms are talked about. No time to talk about that now, but it's very strict in the beginning. And by later, especially with labor markets, at first it's crushed the labor unions. This is 2011, and by 2014, it's do whatever you can, be nice, bring them in. But interesting, and that's, I think, the important point, but Olli Rehn's discourse is still very much Ayatollah-like. Finally, with the Juncker Commission, what we see, which begins in 2015, you see that Juncker decides, okay, we're going to tell the truth about our flexibility, but we're going to have rules for flexibility. It's still the same rules, but increasingly flexible. And the Parliament, I'm not going to spend much time here because we're running out of time. But the big question is it a talking shop, just a talking shop, or an increasingly equal partner? And it's certainly the most input legitimate of EU institutional actors, but the question of how much, given abstention rates, etc., and given the fact that it had no remit in the Eurozone is important. But it starts out with no side at all. It's sidelined in the crisis, and yet it becomes increasingly important, in particular as a go-to body for input legitimacy, in particular the ECB, but also the Council. And what about output legitimacy in the Eurozone crisis? Here, what we see is that it's about the effectiveness of the policy ideas. Certainly, what you see is neoliberal structural reforms, ordoliberal focus on sound money. That doesn't help in terms of the crisis. We see failures in framing and diagnosis. So rather than admitting that it's private debt that has gotten us into the mess, there's a shift in the discourse in 2010, and all of a sudden everyone says it's public debt. In particular, reading off the Greek case. And then once you have the framing as public debt, then the argument is behavioral. Whereas in fact, everyone except Greece had really been following the rules, certainly Ireland and Spain. The real problem was the structure of the euro, but that doesn't come out, so nothing's done. Bad choice of remedies, double down on the rules, and there's a lack of solutions. No fiscal solidarity of any kind, or any significant kind, no euro bonds and EMF, or all of the things that would be useful. And what about policy performance? I mean, there are books and books and books written about it. It's bad. What we see is increasing divergence between surplus and deficit countries. There's relatively little growth in the book. I go on at length about the contrast with the US. The Eurozone is not an optimal currency area, but neither is the US. The US does much better because it does not engage in the harsh austerity or structural reforms that we see in the EU, in particular for program countries. But more generally, the EU has much more austerity, much faster deficit reduction, no room for growth. The debt break, the rule that's been constitutionalized, also highly problematic. And we then see rise in unemployment, poverty. Next, so what about input legitimacy in the euro crisis? There's rising Euroscepticism, declining trust, numbers of different sources of discontent that if you read the literature on rising populism goes through, socioeconomics of people who feel left behind, the sociocultural of people afraid of the changing faces of the nation and their fear of loss of status, but there's also the politics of take back control, most obviously in the case of the UK, but everywhere similarly. And we get increasing political polarization, party realignment, cycling of national governments, massive loss of trust. And you can see the decline of mainstream parties in the periphery. You see mainly center-left parties, but also on the center-right, simply actually almost disappearing down to the single digits. And in the core as well. I think the most extraordinary case is both the center-left and the center-right are almost gone in France as not a populist party, but one that uses some of the instruments, sort of a pro-system rather than an anti-system party, i.e. Macron's La République en Marche takes over. So traditional mainstream parties in decline. At the same time, we see the rise of populist Eurosceptics extremes on the right, the left, and what I call the radical center, that's 5-star. So here we have all of our populist challenges to liberal democracy. And what I think I've shown you by bringing in throughput, by bringing in throughput legitimacy first and saying the attempt by EU actors to govern by the rules and rule by the numbers, even as they try to ameliorate performance and the rest, and to respond to the politics by reinterpreting the rules by stealth, doesn't solve the economic problems. We have a deficit of output legitimacy as a result of the particular response, and also what happens is you get populist challenges to liberal democracy. So I guess the last question is, how do we solve this? Can we do it through more throughput legitimacy? I would argue, basically the European semester needs to be truly bottom-up and flexible. What the European semester is seen as top-down, but with the increasing flexibility, actually, member state governments are getting more of what they want, but not enough. What we need to do is flip the European semester. Continue, yes, with EU coordination and oversight, but give back national control on economic policy, turn the fiscal and competitiveness or productivity councils into industrial policy councils. Let people on the ground decide exactly what would work, and this would help for more national input legitimacy. And also at the macroeconomic level, differentiate recommendations on targets for the member states and have debates, yearly debates, on projections to make the rules at least more compatible with the needs of the Eurozone. And all of this would help counter the populist drift because political parties could finally differentiate themselves again, right and left, on different pathways to economic health and the public good. And this would help also combat populist claims to be the only alternative to EU technocratic rule. We, of course, need more output legitimacy. And so either you do more on all of the things that people have been talking about for a very long time, or we do less. Let member states invest their own resources. So the debt brake makes it very impossible for countries that don't have the so-called fiscal space to invest, and that's Southern Europe, and those in Northern Europe that have the fiscal space, in particular Germany, is not investing, even as infrastructures crumble. So that my argument would be, at the very least, if we're not going to see this great leap forward in safe assets, in individual deposit insurance, a Europe-wide unemployment insurance, we need that. A massive investment fund for the climate change challenges, etc. If we're not getting that, at least let investment happen at the national level by not counting investment in these areas into the deficit. And of course, we need more solidarity, mobility adjustment fund, refugee support funds, all sorts of things like that. And finally, we need more input legitimacy and the unanimity rule. Have constitutional treaties amendable, turn treaty-based laws into ordinary legislation, etc. Bring citizens in more directly, more co-decision method, by essentially making things ordinary legislation. And that's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Schmidt. I think this was a wonderful presentation, which I think doesn't only simply state or restate the challenges that we face, but also points to very concrete solutions. So I think there's a lot of food for thought here. I would now like to ask Professor Raube to share his reflections with us, and also remind our audience, of course, that you can start sending your questions to me via the webinar chat box. Kolja, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vivien, for this most interesting seminar. And obviously, it was fascinating to see you basically going through the three different sorts of legitimacy: input legitimacy, throughput, and output legitimacy, and also showing to us how, from your perspective, they could actually perfectly be improved, enlarged, if you like, at the same time. I would like to comment and come back on a couple of points, perhaps by asking a couple of questions out of curiosity, having worked with some of these concepts myself, thanks to your input and research over the last years. My biggest question in my own research, but also when I listen to your talk, is basically, well, what is the ideal balance? What is the ideal balance between input, throughput, and output legitimacy? You refer to the fact that actually input and output legitimacy can always also contradict each other, that throughput legitimacy may actually be the only sort of legitimacy for democracies that attains either output legitimacy or that may screw input legitimacy, but only if it works bad. Actually, when it works fine, you don't see it, right? That's what you say. So it's like a good waiter in a very good restaurant. You don't feel it, you know. You're being served by throughput legitimacy. The question for me is, what is the balance, and can throughput legitimacy to a certain extent tip input legitimacy into a positive direction, and can it tip output legitimacy into a positive direction? And perhaps we should rather look, and this is perhaps my first comment, look into the relationship between throughput and output legitimacy, and throughput and input legitimacy much more, rather than looking at output and input legitimacy vis-a-vis themselves. So seeing this a little bit like a balance, right? And looking into how throughput legitimacy may tip input or output legitimacy to the one or the other side. That would be my first question. Then I was very intrigued by your methodological reflections, looking at the Eurozone crisis as a way to understand the European Union at large. And my question is basically then a question with regards to the scope of your findings and insights that you bring forward, thanks to the research also in your latest book. The question being, are the dilemmas of the Eurozone crisis, and you alluded to the fact that this is a crisis of democracy, it's not only a crisis of economy, do the problems related to the Eurozone crisis actually relate to persistent patterns of crisis in the European Union beyond the Eurozone crisis? And if that is true, to which degree would also areas that function differently to the Eurozone areas be affected in a similar way, or could you also think of how they are affected differently? So I think I'm coming back to your methodological reflection, whether we can use your approach more from a policy area perspective and looking at the EU as a compartmentalization of different policy areas, or can we actually use it to say something about the EU as a political system? And to which degree are the findings from the Eurozone crisis findings that we can use to observe the system of the EU by and large? And this brings me to a third comment, I think it has to do a lot with input legitimacy. You were mentioning, especially in your conclusions, how important the member states are and how important actually for input, but also for throughput legitimacy, involving member states is bottom up, right? As a tool to overcome perhaps Euroscepticism in the long run by letting actually the better arguments, if I may say so, win in a political contest on the national level. But what if there is something systemically problematic about the member states and the input legitimacy of member states, right? Something that we see not necessarily in the Eurozone as of yet, but that we see obviously in the EU at large, if you look into some of the Central and Eastern European countries, where we can no longer guarantee that input legitimacy is a given, where actually some fundamental procedures are being overcome, where rules are overcome that would allow us to think about democracy the way how you are interpreting it and have defined it in the first place. So I think this is a more general question and a question of curiosity to see how you reflect on what I would call a more systemic crisis of democracy, perhaps, and the rule of law in Europe. And perhaps from our project perspective, because this is taking place in the Reconnect project, one last question: how do we reconnect to the citizens? How do we actually make sure that with perceptions going in all sorts of directions, sometimes perceptions of a lack of output legitimacy, sometimes a perception of a lack of throughput and input legitimacy, how do we make sure that we actually can convince citizens that the European Union is still the better system, the better model to actually overcome crisis and to help improve legitimacy also in the context of their national constituencies. So thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and answer this before I guess we take other questions, but thanks for those great questions. And yeah, it all fits together. In fact, I'll answer the last question first and then go back into the details because it's all connected. And at the end of the book, I actually address some of these questions, and it's really, I mean, you're asking questions about input legitimacy, but also how do we make things work better in the EU? So it's also output legitimacy. And of course, once you ask that, how do we make things work better? It's about governance as well. I mean, one of the problems with separating these things out analytically is that they all come together. And so we can separate them analytically, but they're all of a piece. And so let me take first the Eurozone crisis as a way to see the EU at large. And in fact, in the conclusion, but also in a paper I've done on differentiated integration that's in, I think, Comparative European Politics, I actually address the questions. I don't raise the issue of legitimacy in there because there wasn't room. But the connections are, how do we think of the future? How do we think of not just the Eurozone and its crisis, but all the various crises we've been having? So it's migration, it's Brexit, which can be the disintegration, or, you know, it sort of challenges the integration of the EU. But you also mentioned basically the rule of law crisis. These are all tremendously important. And all of these flow into or also reflect the political crisis that I was alluding to earlier when we talked about politicization at all levels. And what's interesting about the Eurozone crisis is this is the one area where I think the EU has gone too far in terms of integration. And that's where the input legitimacy comes in, this kind of the European semester, but not just the European semester, because it's the way in which it works. Having an architecture of coordination is tremendously important. And as you said, what happens if you have a derive in any one of the member states? And now I'm talking economic policy. We'll get to the, you know, the political, the illiberal democracy stuff in a minute. But you need to have this architecture of coordination because, of course, you want member states to work well, to work appropriately. But what we've had is an architecture of coordination that is perceived, I'm not saying it is, actually, it is to some extent, but is perceived as top-down, as hierarchical, and tremendously problematic at the national level. Certainly, if you look at if you look at graphs, and just take the rise of the extreme right, but we can do it with the extreme left as well. What you saw in the 90s with fears of migration, the extreme right prospers. And if there's a graph that goes up like this, but it plateaus in the 2000s, you know, because you've got economic growth, because the euro seems to be doing well, et cetera. Then all of a sudden in 2007, 8, it goes up with the financial crisis, and then it really takes off with the Eurozone crisis. Say extremists, fantastic. Not only do we have migration to complain about it, we now have the euro, and all of a sudden parties that hadn't really been paying much attention to the euro while everything was going fine, now add that to their playbook. And then, of course, you get the migrant crisis in 2015, and off they go, off the charts. So there's a connection between, that's sort of an illustration of the connection between throughput, output, and input, i.e. the Eurozone's governance by rules and ruling by numbers is problematic on the output side and on the input side. Problematic on the outside, bad performance that has an impact on performance, economic performance, but it also has that bad economic performance has an impact on input, but the bad governance also has a direct effect on input, because we want to take back control. What are they saying? That we're forcing us to do these things that don't work, and we can see, and we're losing jobs. So it's all of that together. But the Eurozone crisis, as I said, has gone too far. But let's take the migration crisis. It's not gone far enough. We've had a moment of when Angela Merkel said to, I'll take 1 million Syrian refugees, as a moment of saying, the EU is standing up for its values. But shortly thereafter, Merkel goes to Istanbul and does the dirty deal with Erdogan. And it's not just Merkel, you see it by EU leaders, but also the Commission or the Council, ensuring that that refugees don't come in. So there, it's not gone far enough in terms of having a common set of asylum rules. But there we need to, and this takes us almost to another topic, we need more differentiated integration. We have to recognize you need a common set of rules in EU immigration policy, but maybe you need different zones of implementation, because you're not going to send Syrian refugees to Hungary. And it's not only because Orban engaged in barbed wire diplomacy, but what refugee, knowing that, would want to be going there? What you need, and part of the problem there is that it's this pattern of punish. Everyone has to take, we'll set quotas, you have to do this. No, why not set up a sort of a range of different kinds of incentives, incentive funds, and actually put some money to, for example, for refugee integration funds. Germany, Sweden have taken tremendous amounts of refugees. Provide them with the cash that would help them integrate refugees. But why not a migrant adjustment fund, that if there is a massive migrant inflow, there's money to national health insurance, for example. That would be the UK. But that would also mean you'd have to prove that there's a massive inflow and that it's a problem, which is also very good. It stops politicians from basically lying or exaggerating. But at the same time, this fund could not only deal with people with the inflows into host countries, but what about outflows? What we're seeing is tremendous. 9,000 doctors have gone, who trained at great expense in Greece, are now practicing in Germany. Romania, Lithuania are losing their best and the brightest to the West, having trained them. So again, So these are only two examples. The EU has some kinds of adjustment funds, but they're woefully too small. They have a globalization fund that, that's laughable in terms of size. So these are all ways to, they don't really, they're ways to ensure that that performance is better. But it's a governance procedure. But back to the legitimacy part, and that is part of my answer to sort of the problem with the EU, especially now, is it has gone very far very quickly, and it's hitting all of those areas of national sovereignty, money, borders, etc. It's gone very far very very quickly. And they touch at we still are in a place where people feel much more loyalty. They feel loyalty to the national level. That is where input legitimacy lies. They elect their politicians who then go to Brussels. And of course, the politicians do a wonderful blame game. Popular policies, I did it, never mention the EU. Unpopular policies, the EU made me do it. That has to change as well. That's on the discursive side. But on the actual implementation side, part of the reason for my suggesting that the European semester needs to be flipped is it's clearly not working the way it is. You still need that architectural coordination, but you've got to give back to the national level. You've got to give back center. You need to give to the center left and the center right the possibility of making different kinds of economic policy programs and actually implementing it, and let the citizens say, because what we see now is populists have been thriving on being able to say, look, it's Tweedledum and Tweedledee. They do the same thing. They follow the Brussels diktats or the German diktats or whatever, rather than making their own policies. Yeah, I think. Oh yeah, and just one last thing on the first, how you can tip one or other side in terms of all of this. And this, I think these are empirical questions. Yeah. And in the book, I in fact go very deeply into the way in which throughput can be, well, actually within throughput, accountability versus transparency, secrecy. So you can say secrecy may not appear throughput legitimate, but if secrecy is used in order to ensure that you have good results, say the secrecy of the council when it was dealing with Greece before the bailout, the last thing you want is anyone to know what they're talking about, or the markets would essentially hammer Greece even more than they were doing. So secrecy actually provides for better output. And you could argue it is about input legitimacy as well, because it's protecting citizens. So, but for each of these, I think what you have to do is see that these are all empirical questions. One last thing on the problem of illiberal democracy. And there, whereas I said that that we need more differentiated integration there, what we see in illiberal democracy is they're trying to dismantle what is the very heart of legitimacy in the EU, which is liberal democracy, which is a balance of institutions, which is ensuring the independence of the judiciary, ensuring the freedom of the press, the probity of institutions, if you will. That can't.
Excellent. Can I suggest we move to the Q&A with our audience? We've received quite some questions, but thank you for this excellent discussion, which I think brought into focus a few of the key points of this presentation. First of all, we have Dimitrios Skiadas, who asks, well, if the Euro crisis is also a political crisis and not simply an economic, crisis, is the proposed establishment of a Eurozone budget able to address these challenges from a throughput legitimacy perspective, assuming that the European Parliament will indeed play a key role in the enactment of the budget itself and its final approval. Then we received quite some questions on the relationship between EU level legitimacy and legitimacy at a national level and how they relate to each other. You mentioned that from a certain perspective at least, the Council is essentially unaccountable. And so we have Carrie Osborne and then questions, well, from another perspective, of course, national leaders are indeed elected, so they are accountable to their own citizens. And so how do the two levels of legitimacy come together? Where is the bar when it comes to EU level legitimacy, and how does national legitimacy fit in and contribute? Can it contribute to legitimize the European Union and authority then at that level? These, of course, are all very, very topical issues. We had one of our audience members, Anna Zukowskaja, who mentioned the B word, Brexit. Of course, we don't want to go into that, but a lot of the debates, of course, revolving around Brexit are in terms of level of legitimacy and authority. Perhaps we can start with these questions, and then we'll have another quick round of questions, and then we bring it to a close.
Okay, yeah, great questions. I think I'll start with the second question, the relationship between the EU and the national level. And this, of course, is complicated because at the national level, we think about legitimacy, democratic legitimacy at the national level, input, output, throughput, all exist at the national level. What's complicated is, and this is the problem for the EU, and I wrote about this in my 2006 Democracy in Europe book, but as more and more policies get taken up from the national level to the EU level, the national level gets emptied of substance in terms of the kinds of political debates you might have about economic policy, about trade, etc. These are all at the EU level now and not at the national. So you could talk about, if we need to talk about a democratic deficit in the 2006 book, I argued that it's actually at the national level rather than the EU level. And I wrote this before a Eurozone crisis, before a European semester that essentially even takes budgetary power out of the realm of the national parliaments in a very real sense, and puts it between the national government and the EU level. For the European semester, the European Commission, and in it, the Director General of Economics and Finance in particular in those first 2 years, was to vet national budgets even before national parliaments had a chance to look. That is a severe problem for national input legitimacy. In theory, in principle. In practice, however, what you see is lots of national parliaments never had much of a say over national budgets anyway. And when the process has proceeded, there haven't been major protests. So, you know, why is this? You could say, well, because it's fully legitimate that the Irish and, you know, accepted this. Or you could say, well, they had no other choice. Is this input legitimate? Is it throughput legitimate? Or they just did it because it's, you know, fear that it would be worse if they didn't. And in the book, what I do is I go through the different cases. There's no time really to talk about each individual case here. But, you know, so national leaders, they're elected, they're accountable, politically accountable to their, as representatives, so that's input legitimacy. But how accountable are they? Or how truly representative? And this is Peter Mayer's argument, sort of the difference between, or the tension between representation and responsiveness, that they are, or responsibility and responsiveness. They tend to be more responsible to the international or the supranational, the EU agreements that they made, rather than to responsive to the citizens. And with the Eurozone crisis, that's the perfect example of that. No, sorry, we can't do that. We know we promised X when we were elected, but we're actually doing the opposite. The worst case, and we saw what happened, is with France and Hollande, who campaigns for growth. And then the minute he comes in, he says, oh, no, actually, we need to be credible with our partners in order to be able to change the rules. So actually, I'm going to engage in austerity rather than growth. And we saw what his fate was. I mean, part of the reason that you're seeing the upheaval at the national level is that citizens are angry with their national representatives as well as the EU. You look at Eurobarometer polls, and it's clear that, whatever lack of trust they have in the EU, it's even worse for national governments. But I want to add one thing about the council. When I said the council is unaccountable to an external forum, well, one argument you could make to say that it's not, that this is not procedurally illegitimate, is that you could argue that there's a kind of mutual accountability through a deliberative process that goes on in the council. So this would be member states. So the member states are not in member state leaders are not in a representative forum, which is what they kind of think they're doing when they're there saying we're representing our people, therefore this is a representative forum, and not really, especially when they impose, say, on Portugal, decisions that the Portuguese people would not necessarily welcome. However, so on the input side, no, but on the procedural, you could say, well, to the extent that there's deliberation and is mutually accountable, you could argue that this is actually legitimate in procedural terms. The only problem with this is that for it to be a truly deliberative, accountable body, there would have to be, everyone is there as equals, there shouldn't be any sense of threat from anyone. And of course, the problem in the Eurozone crisis is that member states in the program countries, member states under pressure, so here think about Italy or Spain, end up finding themselves compelled. This is not a mutually accountable, a truly deliberative, mutually accountable body at the point at which some of the member states feel pressured to do what other member states insist on. So here, I think we have to talk about the North-South divide being very, very serious. I mean, I use Germany as the headline in the council as German diktats, but we can also mention the Finns and the Dutch, who are right behind Germany, in some cases even pushing farther than Germany did. So on the diktat side. On the other hand, what we can see is, as a deliberative forum, the council actually did change. And so it's not entirely dictatorship, but it's also not entirely a deliberative body. And so on the Eurozone budget question, we have to see what the Eurozone budget is. That's if it's going to be a big one, then certainly it needs to be administered by, I think community method is the most important. And generally speaking, what I see is the only way, and that was the last slide, the only way to move toward greater legitimacy is the kind of mutual deliberative accountability that you get when all three institutions, Council, Commission, and European Parliament, are in constant interaction and discussion. I think that's the only way that we can, especially at that level of remove. But at the same time, and for the Eurozone budget, then how do you allocate? Where does it go? I suppose it becomes an administrative matter, so it would be much more the Commission that would administer it, but under the directions or rules or suggestions of the various of the various EU actors. And finally, for Brexit, I don't think we want to go there.
Yes, we agree. We all agree on that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Kolja, is there anything you would like to briefly add?
I would suggest we go on with the next set of questions.
The final set of questions before we bring it a close. We have Christopher Stark, who asks, what about data-driven policymaking, which is now on the rise? Can it improve legitimacy? And if so, at which level within the input, throughput, output framework? We then have Topper Sherwood, who asks instead, well, how do we measure in a truly objective manner the degree to which we have input, throughput, or output legitimacy? This going beyond, for example, opinion polls or voter participation, and so on. And third question brings us to the kind of the other dimension of all of these debates, which is perceptions. Where Konstantin Schäfer asks, well, what, on the other hand, what matters most to EU citizens? What form of legitimacy should be strengthened at an EU level in terms of what expectations are from a citizen's perspective? And then a very, very final question to kind of bring this to a close from Jakub Sindela. Is the EU ready for the next Euro crisis? Which is, of course, a big one, I guess, but back to you.
Okay, well, the answer to the last question is easy. No. I think that's really the problem. The EU has not put in place everything that it needs. So here on the output legitimacy side, it's things I mentioned in the slide, the first concluding slide. There's no European deposit and individual deposit insurance. That's key for the banks. The banking union doesn't have a sufficient backstop, for the single resolution fund. So perhaps the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, can do that, but highly problematic. What you need is a European monetary fund there. But you need a Eurozone budget. Back to the budget question, you need a serious budget to do all of the things. I was just at a conference yesterday at Harvard where one person suggested that rather than trying to fix the old things and spend more money, since we're in an impasse, and again, is it German diktats? Is it Northern Europe hesitating, not wanting to go farther? Not my money, guys, we're not going to spend it. Then try to find ways to reinvigorate the Eurozone economy some other way. So the big, Green New Deal, big infrastructure projects of various kinds, internet, here's the digital data-driven policy, internet connectivity, all of that the EU would need to do, needs to get ready for the future challenges. And if it were to spend money on that, that would probably help growth in so many ways that it might help solve the problems of the Eurozone that we find intractable now. You need to get rid of debt overhang, say for Italy. That's key. Nothing, there's been no movement there. So, but if you can't do any of the things that need to be done, at least start spending money. Maybe so that we don't, Italy needs to grow out, and Italy needs to grow in order to get rid of its debt. Its debt is sustainable so long as it grows. It's not growing is what the problem is. So these are all output legitimacy issues in terms of, is it ready for the Eurozone crisis? But the governance is not ready either. So on the procedural issues, it's not there. And that's why I basically say, let's get serious. The Eurozone, the sort of a European semester, the reinterpreting the rules by stealth, is essentially a kind of oversight mechanism that does no more now than kind of help. It's just yet another mechanism that doesn't really do much of anything, but is perceived by the citizens as more intrusions on national sovereignty, and is, grist for the mill for the populists. You still need you need some coordination architecture. It's this amazing system, which is fantastic. which provides for, let's call it, deliberation across the EU member states with the EU. That's good. That brings the EU together. But do it in a positive way rather than a negative way. Tell the member states, okay, you need to do what you can do. You know, you need industrial policy councils at the national level to figure out what will make them grow. Not productivity councils or fiscal councils that are fiscal hawks. Oh, you're spending too much. The problem is that with interest rates as low as they are, in the minus realm for most countries, if you do big projects for infrastructure, if we can't get an EU budget, get a national one, you know. But that means doing something about the debt break that doesn't allow most of the countries that are most in need of investing to invest. So those are all, so if we can't get an EU, we need a big EU level budget. If we can't get a big EU level budget, let the member states do their own investing. You know, you can invest now at such low interest rates out for 30 years, it costs you nothing, but it does raise your debt. And by the rules, if you can't raise your debt, you're in trouble. Or you can't do it maybe in terms of the deficit rules. So all of that, and what you see is basically the Commission knows this and is being much, much more flexible. But in the Council, you get Northern Europeans saying, wait, they're cheating on the rules. You know, the rules are not going to get you. And this is the, you know, this is Kolja's asking, what are the connections? The rules are not going to get you to good output. Yeah. And actually, throughput is less important for us, certainly than input or output, which are the big things. And the problem is that if you keep focusing on the rules, the procedural legitimacy, and you lose the big picture of, for you, meaning Northern Europeans, lose the big picture about it. And then one thing I haven't said is, you might say, yeah, but why don't they follow the rules? Or you might say, so what's the problem of legitimacy if, you know, Southern Europeans just, you know, it's their problem. But everyone is part of the EU. And as part of the EU, you're a part of a community of fate. And legitimacy means a better life for everyone. And so the whole idea of the Eurozone was the assumption that it would converge and it would converge upwards. What now we're seeing is divergence, where you're seeing a downward trajectory for Southern Europe. And it looks upward for Northern Europe, but wait a minute, this whole focus, the fetishism of export-focused growth, export-led growth, fine, until you can't export. China is slowing. You know, this next crisis may be one which is going to hit Germany and Northern Europe more than everyone, but Germany in particular, because it's focused on export. And what happens then when the Germans start saying, please, Southern Europe, help us out? Well, should have thought of that. Perceptions, what form of legitimacy strengthen, you know, again, I'm not exactly sure how to take this question, but I think I've largely answered it. Basically, all forms of legitimacy need to be strengthened at the EU level. And how do you measure? Any which way you can, basically. And that's what I've done. I've looked for every single source, qualitative, quantitative, yes, opinion surveys, surveys, opinion polls. So it depends what we're looking at. For the economics, I've looked at, you know, I've done lots of the charts and graphs of, and the statistics about growth and looking at inequality and poverty levels and all of that. Yeah. And I guess for data-driven policy, would that help procedural legitimacy? Perhaps, but that's just one of many ways in which one has to talk about procedural legitimacy. I think we've probably really run out of time.
We have run out of time, but I think we've all enjoyed it so much that hasn't been a problem at all. I think we need to bring it to a close, and so I would like to really thank our speakers, Professor Vivien Schmidt and Professor Kolja Raube, for finding time to contribute to our Reconnect webinar series. Professor Schmidt, we hope to welcome you again to one of our future Reconnect events. Before leaving you, I would like to announce some future Reconnect activities. Our Reconnect webinar series will continue in December with a webinar with Professor Jan Werner-Müller from Princeton University, who will discuss the challenges of populism in the European Union. Please stay tuned for further details. For updates on the Reconnect project and for further information, please visit our website at reconnect-europe.eu. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you will join us again next time. From Vivien Schmidt, Kolja Raube, and myself, thank you and goodbye.